So not big, can it still keep it small? And IPF, a hyped maturity, is what I'm trying to talk about. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea as to what we have tried to work on the Humazen analyzer to get some newer parameter, which already some people have spoken about and discussed. So platelet counts, we all know, we see the platelets on the smear, and when we see these kind of cells over there, these are your platelets. Of course, they are large. I'll not get into the morphology part of it, and I'll just directly move on to this picture. Now, when I show you this picture here, I showed you the platelets behind, and now you see these. What's common between platelets and all of them? There's no disorder here. What's common between all of them? So they're forever controversial, you know. And in the previous presentation, we saw the same, didn't we? Somebody saying it, IPF, not so immature. Other guy saying, no, they are large. The third guy saying, no, they are a combination of both, some small, some large. I'm thoroughly confused. So what I have done in my presentation is, I would definitely show you a little bit of work that we are still kind of ongoing in our lab, but I have put it across in these subtitles, and I'm not going to read all of them for the want of time. And I'm just going to go directly to another picture here, and unfortunately or fortunately, it's a man. Platelets, only men have worked. I don't know why. I was trying to figure out if there are some women who have worked, and I'll come to the women later. So can you tell me who's this guy? I honestly don't know how to pronounce his name. So he's the man who discovered them. And I was still trying to figure out as to how to, call his name out. And it's something like Bizzero. So Dr. Sukesh is around, and I think he is better apt at Italian pronunciation. Maybe he'll help us. So he's the first guy who described the platelets long back. And of course, historically, as we were discussing what should be the methods which are the right methods for counting platelets, we talked about the direct methods and the indirect methods. And then, of course, the semi-automated methods. Previously, we were using the platelet-rich plasma. And of course, the fully automated methods, which we are all using in our laboratories now. A little bit of peek in the history. This is the first one. The reverse dark field microscopy was the first methodology which was used. And of course, the Technicon instruments were the one which were the first instruments to be used for counting platelets and other cells as well. And of course, hydrodynamic focusing, a lot of people have talked about it. So again, I'm not going to touch in detail about it. And importantly, the optical part of it, which includes flow cytometry, is the methodology of choice which has been appearing today. So what's the reference method? Of course, previously, this is what the reference method was. The manual phase contrast microscopy or the chamber counting, which was talked about. And of course, Dr. Shahnaz was telling us, in the places where they don't have a flow cytometer, what do? They still do this. But what is the right method or the method which is of choice today for ICSH? It's the flow cytometry, and it's been in vogue for quite some time. And this is how they do it. Obviously, you have the platelets which are identified separately vis-a-vis the RBCs, and of course, you take the coincidence events out and take the debris out as well. I'll not get into details of how they're counting, but that's where the whole concept comes up. And these are the various instruments which are available and have various methodologies of principles of counting of platelets. Now let's look at general aspects of automated platelet counts a little bit. I'm sure all of you know when the sample gets aspirated into the machine, it gets divided into two parts, the RBC and the WBC channel. And it's the RBC channel which eventually goes into the hemoglobin part of it. And of course, the platelets are counted there as well. So if you look at it, the white cells get lysed up front. So the moment white cells get lysed up front, that's where the red cells and the platelets remain. And they are in large numbers, and they have the influence they have the possibility of influencing each other. Now, impedance-based platelet counts, of course, these two gentlemen, again, the two men were there, were given by these two men. Do you know them? The Coulter brothers, of course, yeah. So these are the Coulter brothers who gave us the principle of Coulter, which we are already aware of. And of course, every time the cell passes through, we get an impulse. And depending upon the size of the impulse, we're able to segregate between various cell types. And that's how the platelets are actually counted. And of course, once you get that, depending on the size, you are categorizing them as the smallest cell in this impedance channel, right? So the first Coulter counter required to use the PRP. And why was that so? Because they wanted to make sure that they're not influenced by the red cells. And the red cells are quite large in number. And of course, eventually we had the hydrodynamic focusing. And then we wanted to make sure that, they're not recounted. I'll not get into details of this now because this is something which we all know. And then the histograms which came up into the picture. How did the histogram? This was a question somebody asked yesterday. How do you get that? And of course, the pulses which are there. And then the fitting curve, which has been given a lot of importance by a lot of us all across last about almost 15, 20 years. Now, this is where the picture started. I'll not get into the various measurements, how the fitting curve comes. But important point what I wanted to mention here is that it's influenced by a lot of other things. So just to enumerate it here, you have spike towards left and the spike towards right, which is going to influence your platelet counts. And as is mentioned over here, there is this overlap region, which we all know can give us problems in appropriate platelet counting. And that's why we all talk about all these various methodologies of optical, fluorescent, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the various analyzers which have come out with a lot of methodologies of impedance and optics together. I'm just going through quickly. And the optical and all the fluorescent platelet counts are the ones which are based primarily on the flow cytometry principle. I'll again not get into details of that. But remember, it's the RNA and the scatter properties from the cells which are actually giving you that information. Similar replica happens even in Unison. And in this analyzer also, as Rajesh has already shown in his presentation, you have this very characteristic area where there is the pickup of the platelets. And then the platelet counts are also given across to the optical platelet counts are given. Same thing happens in many other fluorescent analyzers, like for this one also. And when all this is happening, obviously there is this parameter which comes over here and everybody talks about it, and this is IPF. And that's what IPF was all about. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about what I would prefer to call a reticulated platelet rather than an immature platelet to take the controversy out of whether it's immature or mature. So reticulated platelets is nothing but an increased amount of RNA which is present within these cells, and obviously they are very, very active. And they are very mature, and they have a very high mean volume, and they show increased amounts of RNA. And as is shown in the previous, which was shown in the slide also, this particular platelet is actually a platelet which is getting generated from the marrow and can be large in size, and as mentioned, can be small as well. So how do you quantify the reticulated platelets? The best and the simplest methodology of handling it is by flow cytometry. And of course, thiazole orange dye is the one which was being used initially. And obviously, there will be reference ranges which will be variable. And therefore, because there is variable reference ranges in different instruments, there is no standardization across the instruments of IPF. And it was, in fact, studied as a measure of platelet kinetics. And that's why everybody's talking about whether the marrow is producing enough or not producing enough is something that what we would be making out from the IPF. So if you look at thrombocytopenia and you have reticulated platelets over there, if they're increased, there should be increased marrow megakaryocytes. That means you're having destruction. And otherwise, if they are decreased, then that means the marrow is actually getting affected. And this is, we all know, of course, the platelets come out like the way they come out. And this one slide I wanted to show you is because the hype that is about the IPF. In fact, this has been done by Dr. Kunal many years back. And just read out what it says. Immature platelet fraction. Will IPF unleash a new fresh wave of envy? And trust me, people who did not have IPF were all envious of the people who had IPF at that moment of time. So what is IPF? We all know, as everybody talks about it, these are these larger platelets which are seen with higher fluorescence and a larger size. And of course, what has been mentioned in the literature is that they have active marrows will produce more of them. And obviously, it's some studies are also showing that it's the first indicator of bone marrow regeneration. And obviously, all of us have to define our own reference ranges, which we do in our respective laboratories. And the most of the credit of giving IPF its glamour quotient goes to these two Mumbai ladies, along with the team, Dr. Shehnaz and Dr. Tina. And they came out with this paper. This was the paper which came out in 2013. And I don't know what happened after that. It was like, just spread like wildfire. IPF, everybody wanted to take credit for IPF, and IPF seemed to be the kid on the block. And this is one of the slides which I have taken from Dr. Tina, where she showed how IPF actually helped her to look at the dengue, and I'll just show you that slide as well. And this is how they demonstrated that the moment the IPF, the platelets go down in dengue, and the IPF keeps going up, and the moment the IPF becomes stable, the platelets are just about to recover. And that was kind of a very interesting study for which she was awarded also by ISLH. So whether immature or mature, I don't know, but this fraction of the platelets actually became famous because of the ladies. All right. So IPF in dengue, this is something which they have already demonstrated in their paper and have shown that more than 10% at that point of time was probably indicator of platelet recovery, which eventually was proven in some studies that may not be so. Now, immature platelet fraction, what is so immature about it, is my question, and it has been the question in the morning talk as well. So if you look at immature platelets, what is an immature platelet? And Dr. Sukesh would be one who would probably appreciate this picture more. An immature platelet is a proplatelet, and a proplatelet is a platelet like this, right? So it's like a fragment, like a small little tail. You don't have these tiny little, small little particles like this. So immature platelets, the true immature platelets are not the platelets which you're seeing. They're larger platelets. Of course, they can be immature as well. You can have smaller platelets which can be immature as well, and what Rajesh has already mentioned in his presentation. So immature platelets need not necessarily be these large ones. They can be even the small ones, and that's what needs to be kept in mind. All right, so larger and a higher fluorescent platelet is what we pick up on the analyzers, and these larger and higher fluorescence platelets is what is measured as the fraction, which is immature, and that is eventually given as an answer for recovery or no recovery of the marrow. So the question is, every time you do this, you want to run it in a retic mode, and at the same time, you need to get the results which you should otherwise try and get at a cheaper cost. So what would you like to do? We thought, let's look at the platelet to large cell ratio in the analyzer which had come to our laboratory for just an evaluation. And we looked at PLCR on this analyzer. Now, what is this PLCR? PLCR is a ratio between the platelet large cells versus the platelet count, right? And this is calculated as a formula on the analyzer itself. Now, I'm giving a statement here. PLCR is virtually practically directly proportional to IPF, and I'm sure Tina will not agree with it. But it's okay, we'll see that in the subsequent presentation. So this is the data that we pick up, and I would like to thank Aisha, who actually, again, a lady, helped us in this whole activity, got the data out, and we looked at what happened to IPF in one of the analyzers that we use versus what happens to the PLCR. Obviously, both of them have to increase, and that's what happened in reality as well. Of course, we had one odd cases which were outliers, but most of them did follow this pattern. That was the control group, and the cases were 53, and in all of them, again, we had almost similar patterns. Of course, the ranges will be different because PLCR has a much higher range. And then when we looked at the literature, what we realized is in the literature also, the IPF has been shown to be obviously very clearly differentiating between hyper and hypoproliferative states of thrombocytopenia. And again, if you look at the PLCR, it's also giving you significant p-values in the literature as well. And when we looked at our data, we also did regression analysis and found that IPF as well as the PLCR are not that far behind from each other compared to what was there in the literature already. IPF had a higher ROC with respect to the PLCR in the literature quoted previously, but in our case, it was almost nearly similar. So to summarize, IPF and PLCR are useful parameters in the assessment of thrombocytopenia, whether hyper or hypoproliferative. And if you look at the area under the curve in our study, vis-a-vis the IPF as well as the PLCR, we had the discriminatory ability for PLCR also to give us an idea of whether we're dealing with hyper or hypoproliferative cases. And therefore, labs who are not in possession of an instrument with IPF can at least fall back upon PLCR as a surrogate marker with almost similar connotations. So to finalize, of course, there is a lot of envy with IPF, and I say, why envy mere yaar? IPF nahi hua to kya? Ab aapke paas hai PLCR. So thank you very, very much, and have a great day ahead. Any questions?
So Anil, we said that they're high in RNA. That we agree because you said they're reticulated. So when they're high in RNA, they're not immature.
Okay, so by convention also when the platelets are actually being manufactured, in any case they will be produced in all various sizes. While they are immature that way because they have a higher RNA content, the smaller ones will also have a higher RNA content and they will get removed from your analysis, which Rajesh has very nicely presented in his presentation. So therefore, making sure that, okay, fine, you want to call it immature, let us call it immature, but at the same time, we still have those tiny, small little ones which are being missed out. So that's why the concept is that why call it immature or mature, just call them large platelets.
Maybe they can call them highly fluorescent platelets. They have a highly fluorescent lymphocyte.
Yes,
they
of
can
course.
rename them because they are being countered by fluorescence, no?
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, if we continue to agree that they are high RNA content, but we are not agreeing whether they're immature or immature.
The concept of immaturity is primarily from the fact that immature platelet, which is akin to a reticulocyte, is something which is a proplatelet. So that's why people have, kind of question mark with respect to the immaturity of the platelets. But otherwise, the concept-wise, in terms of RNA, you're right.
Questions, please. Please ask questions because people who are not using either of the machines may have more questions, Somebody who doesn't have IPF, somebody who doesn't have HORIBA, I would expect you people, and I'm sure they are in the audience. I don't know what the parameters are named in the other
Dr.
machines.
Shikha, go ahead.
So basically, I've noticed in certain cases of myelodysplasia, the IPF values are higher. Although the reticulocytes and all are low, but the reticulated platelets, if they are reflected by IPF, they're found to be higher than in normal cases. So
when I look at IPF, the first point of contention with IPF is this only, as you have rightly pointed out. There will be conditions like myeloproliferative neoplasms, there will be conditions like MPNs and MDSs, wherein again you will have these larger platelets. They will have that dysplastic changes and they would have come out in the periphery earlier. They would fall into that area and you would calculate them as immature, and that's one of the reasons why the term immature may not be appropriate. So therefore, calling them large platelets falling in that region would be a preferable term. Again, you will get to know better only when you do a marrow in such circumstances. So therefore, everything cannot be just defined by an IPF alone. If somebody is having thrombocytopenia, you do an IPF and it's absolutely normal or coming within the normal age, it doesn't rule out myelodysplastic syndrome still. It all has to be seen in a context. But when we are talking about IPF being a marker which is going to help you, our aim is to look at acute onset thrombocytopenias, especially ITPs and stuff like that, where it is of a very good value, where again PLCR also becomes an important surrogate marker, and that's where it has the maximum utility. But the point is very well taken. When you look at dysplastic states or myeloproliferative neoplasms, the statement may not hold its water.
Thank you, Anil. I think we will end this session.
Thank you, everyone.
Now.